A very good evening to everyone, and welcome to this seminar lecture on understanding Palestine, especially by our Professor A.K. Ramakrishnan. Professor A.K. Ramakrishnan, the former chairperson of the Center for West Asian Studies, School of International Studies, is a professor in Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He has been the director of Human Rights Studies program at JNU. He was a professor and director of the Center for West Asian Studies, Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi, and the director of the School of International Studies and Politics at Mahatma Gandhi University, Kottayam, Kerala. He was an international scholar at Bucknell University, Pennsylvania, USA, and a visiting professor in Alame Tabatabai University, Tehran, Iran. He was also an Erasmus visiting professor at Universitat Pompeu Fabra, Barcelona, Spain, and Kanaus Technical University, Lithuania. His areas of interest includes West Asian studies, theory of international studies, gender, and post-colonialism. He has published the work Us Perceptions of Iran, Approaches and Policies, and co-edited Society and Changes in Contemporary Gulf. His articles and reviews have been published in reputed journals such as International Studies, Scandinavian Journal of Development Alternatives and Area Studies, Millennium Journal of International Studies, Contemporary South Asia, and Inter-Asia Cultural Studies. So without any further delay, I would request Professor A.K. Ramakrishnan to deliver his lecture on understanding Palestine. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Asima, for those nice words. And I thank Dr. Omer Anas for providing me with this opportunity. And I thank everyone in CSPS for arranging this kind of a lecture. What I will do today on this broad theme of understanding Palestine is to provide a political understanding of the question of Palestine rather than other aspects of Palestine, geographical, cultural, religious, and many other aspects of Palestine. I'll concentrate mostly on the political aspect of Palestine and a little bit about the political history of it in modern times. I may not be discussing a whole lot about Israeli politics and international politics connected with Palestine. I'll discuss them, particularly about Israel, because Israel is a central actor as far as the Palestine issue is concerned. And therefore, to the extent that it is required to elaborate on the question of Palestine, I'll refer to Israeli politics as well, only to that extent, not in detail. So, first of all, the common understanding about the issue of Palestine is that there is a struggle between the Israelis and the Palestinians, which is mostly understood as a kind of religious struggle, particularly between the Jews and the Muslims. The first point I want to stress upon is that these kinds of generalized views do not do justice to the actuality of the question of Palestine. Because when you say it is an Arab-Israeli question or a Palestinian-Israeli question, there is an assumption that there are two sides who are almost equally poised and they have a trouble among themselves. And therefore, there is this conflict that emerges out of it. That is a myopic view of the Palestine question because there are no two equal parties here at all. And therefore, it is not a struggle between, a tussle between a war between two equal sides. By no means that kind of an argument is sustainable. The other point about the religious notions about the question of Palestine. Majority of the Palestinian people are Muslims, but there is a substantial Christian minority among the Palestinians. And there are Jewish people within Israel and more so across the world who are in support of the Palestine question. And there is the state of Israel and a large chunk of Jewish people supporting the state of Israel. And therefore, you will see that a neat equation between the Jews on the one hand and Muslims on the other, again, do not do justice to the complexity of the Palestine issue, particularly the complexity and the diversity of the religious issue on the one hand and ideological persuasions on the other hand, because many people belonging to the same religion need not possess similar kind of ideology as far as the political matter of the question is concerned. So what is the crux of the Palestine problem then? The crux of the problem is that Palestine is still, when we speak today, is still under a colonial occupation. Even though we have seen the end of official colonialism in many parts of the world by the second half of the 20th century, that end of the official colonialisms in India, in Algeria, in many parts of the world. But that colonial experience did not end as far as Palestinians are concerned. They are still under colonial occupation. Under the colonial occupation of the state of Israel from 1948, under colonial policies much before that, and in the modern history of Palestine, the Palestinian people had to face two kinds of colonialisms, particularly in the first half of the 20th century. One is the British colonial rule in Palestine, particularly from the early 1920s under the British mandate given by the League of Nations. And Palestine, which was earlier under the Ottoman Empire, with the First World War, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and then you had the areas which were previously under Ottoman rule, including Palestine. They were divided by imperialist powers, Western imperialist powers like France and Britain. And Palestine came under the British mandate. Syria and Lebanon came under French mandate. The mandatory provisions in the League of Nations is a very interesting proposition. The mandatory provision said that these countries, whose future that these victorious powers of the First World War was determining, and which is in a way legitimized by the League of Nations. The League of Nations mandatory provision said that the people of this region, referring to Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, etc., they do not have the ability to rule themselves. And therefore, the civilized nations, that's the language that is used, the civilized nations have the responsibility to rule them until they acquire the ability to rule themselves. So you see how this civilizing mission, civilizing the so-called barbarians, Uh, they are calling the barbarians. Colonialism called um, every Asian African people as barbarians. The same was repeated. This time, not only through individual colonial entity, but through supposedly an international organization like the League of Nations. And so one of two civilized nations that are recognized is Britain and France. And Britain took over the mandated rule in Palestine. And therefore, their civilizing mission was in a way authenticated by the League of Nations. But by that time, by early 20s when this happened, the British Empire had already given its consent to the establishment of a Jewish home in Palestine through the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which the Balfour Declaration, Lord Balfour, who was the Foreign Secretary of Britain, was writing to Lord Rothschild, a Zionist leader, and the British government stated through Balfour's letter that His Majesty's government, the British government, view with favor the establishment in Palestine, a Jewish national home. It also talks about the point that this kind of establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine should not affect the rights of other set of population that are living in Palestine, even though that part is never taken up for serious kind of discussions with regard to the Balfour Declaration. Why was Lord Balfour writing this to Rothschild, the Zionist leader? What is Zionism? And this is very important because that determined several aspects of Palestinian life later. And the Zionist movement, which emerged in Europe in the late 19th century, was a Jewish national identity question, establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine, and therefore Jewish nationalism emerging in Europe. And most of you know that under the leadership of Theodor Herzl, the First World Zionist Congress was held in 1897 in Basel in Switzerland. This is important because, at that time, the Jewish people in Europe in general were facing anti-Semitism in several countries, extending up to Russia. And in Russia, it was very severe. In Eastern Europe, in many parts of Western Europe, and so on and so forth. If the World Zionist Organization was called, they met in 1897. In 1896 itself, Theodor Herzl wrote his booklet, Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state. So in the book, The Jewish State, Theodor Herzl talked about the possibility of establishing a Jewish national home. That's the term that's used during that time. He was, in the first part of that book, he was describing the anti-Semitic developments in Europe and how Jewish people are suffering out of it. But Herzl and his colleagues were not typical religious Jews by any means. They were asserting the Jewish identity with respect to the situation in Europe at that point of time. What is interesting in that book is that Herzl is talking about establishing a Jewish national home in some place. And one subheading in the book is Jewish national home, Argentine or Palestine, whether we should think of establishing a Jewish nation in Argentina or in Palestine. So even the founder of modern political Zionism is not very sure about where this state should come about. He is weighing the options. And in the World Zionist Congress and among the leaders themselves, there was discussion about Africa, about Uganda, for example. So it's an interesting development. This was the time, late 19th century, was the time of European nationalism, you should remember. And Zionism was also influenced by the European nationalist idea. But this nationalism was not the mainstream nationalism of the Germans or of the French and others, but a nationalism of people who face anti-Semitism in Europe. And therefore, a nationalism that cannot be imagined as part of Europe's own, being part of Europe's own political, system. And they were imagining it away from Europe, Argentina or Uganda or Palestine. Palestine was more appealing to many because they thought that it will bring about certain religious memories, and that religious kind of identification with Palestine can make the Jews of Europe accept this kind of a nationalist ideology. Because already in 1897, when in Basel the first Congress was held, this Congress was not supposed to be held in Basel. It was scheduled to be held in Munich. And there was tremendous opposition from the Jewish community in Munich against this kind of a hilarious idea about founding a Jewish state somewhere else. Because most of the Jews in Europe at that point of time, in the 19th century, thought about the anti-Semitism as a European problem and to be resolved within Europe. And therefore, there was opposition in Munich, and that is why the World Zionist Congress, first Congress itself, was to be shifted to Basel, where they held the conference. What is important as far as Palestine is that it is this European Jewish nationalists who were connecting Europe now to Palestine and opting for Palestine, a place which in the discussions of 1897 in the World Zionist Congress states that you should systematically colonize Palestine. The colonization of Palestine is mentioned as a major agenda of the World Zionist Organization. And then later you find the World Zionist Fund being organized, and under the aegis of the World Zionist Organization, systematic Jewish migration from Europe to Palestine started coming up. Even though earlier, before the World Zionist Organization being formed, you had Jewish migration from parts of Europe, particularly from Russia, etc., to Palestine, which were, normal kind of migrations, not systematic waves of migrations. But from late 19th century onwards, particularly in the 20th century, you have waves of Jewish migration from Europe to Palestine. And this was transforming the the demographic situation in Palestine, the political situation in historical Palestine. And that is where this European idea was becoming an important matter of grave concern to the inhabitants of Palestine. So in the first half of the 20th century, the Palestinians were facing two kinds of colonialisms. One is British colonialism, and the other is European Jewish colonization of Palestine. And therefore, the Palestinian struggle, particularly expressed in a big manner in the 1930s, when the waves of immigration started to become much bigger, because huge migration out of Europe was happening because of the assertion of the Nazi ideology and Hitler's rule, etc., and Nazi occupation of various lands in Europe. And therefore, the Jewish population was going out of Europe. A large chunk of them went to the United States, etc. But many also were going to Palestine. So there is an increased Jewish migration from Europe to Palestine. And this has created big problems within Palestine. And in 1936, it became a kind of civil war sort of situation in Palestine. There were, conflict between the two, fighting emerging between the inhabitants of Palestine and the Jewish immigrants who were coming from Europe. 1936 to 39, it was a major issue. And the British mandatory power, which already committed in 1917 to the establishment of a Jewish national home, had to support the Jewish cause, at the same time had to deal with the civil war situation as well. So you could see them adjusting to the situation sometimes, appeasing both sides, but already committed basically to the establishment of a Jewish state, and finding it very difficult to control the situation on the ground. And the British administration, also, notorious for the policy of divide and rule, in which we are very familiar in India under British colonialism. That was the same with Palestine. And British policies themselves have complicated the situation to such extent that it became a major problem from the 1930s onwards. And Britain, after the Second World War, its grand empire was collapsing, as you know. It has to leave many of its colonies. It lost India. It lost many of its, kind of great power, or in today's terms, superpowers, status by that time after the Second World War. And it also wanted to leave Palestine, end its mandatory rule. And it declared that by May 15, 1948, it will leave Palestine. So that declaration was coming in 1947 itself. And in 47, this was referred to the United Nations. The United Nations established a UN Special Commission on Palestine to decide about the future of Palestine once Britain leaves Palestine. And that UN Special Commission on Palestine, had two major sets of proposals on the future of Palestine. One was a federal plan where in Palestine there will be a Jewish state as well as a Palestinian Arab state, and there will be Jerusalem as a separate entity, and all these will be linked in a federal state. That was one set of proposals, which did not get enough support, which was a kind of minority voice. What got major support in the UN Special Commission's own deliberations was the partition of Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. And this was voted in the UN, in the UN General Assembly. And then you would see that the UN General Assembly adopted the partition resolution. Even though India was a member of the UNSCOP, its voice was with the minority, India, Iran, etc. They proposed, because of our own experience at that point of time of, partition. India supported the federal plan. But what was accepted was the partition plan. So in 1948, mid-May, what is supposed to happen was under the UN aegis, two states were supposed to emerge because there was map prepared of what portions go to the Jewish state and what to the Palestine Arab states, etc. But what you have is a unilateral declaration of the formation of the State of Israel in May 14 by the Zionist leadership. And once the State of Israel, and there was no concomitant coming into being of a Palestinian Arab state. So a Jewish state being unilaterally declared, and then immediately following that, you have the United States recognizing that new state, and it was followed by many others. And you could see that no major powers were interested in seeing that the Palestinian Arab state is established along with this. No. And immediately after the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, you had the Arab-Israeli War, because this kind of what is thought to be the imposition of the State of Israel in Palestine or on the Palestinians was opposed by the Arab states around. And after the war, what you see is more territories than what was allotted to the Jewish side for their state was controlled by the new State of Israel. And that continued. And until now, you don't have a Palestinian state to be established. So the establishment of an independent sovereign Palestinian state is at the core of the Palestinian problem now. But it did not end, the problems did not end with 48, with the establishment of the State of Israel in historical Palestine. Israel expanded its territories, and major part of that was coming in 1967. But in 1948, there were Palestinian villages Muslim villages, Christian villages. Many villages were being totally demolished. Large chunk of Palestinian refugees from that part of Palestine, which is now Israel, started going out to the rest of the Palestine, to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and to other countries, to Jordan, to Lebanon, and so on. And it's very important to note that the Palestinians will be the only set of people for such a longer period of time being refugees in their own land, because you have lots of Palestinian refugee camps within the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which were part of historical Palestine. And you have big Palestinian diaspora in the surrounding states, in Jordan and in Lebanon, in South Lebanon in particular, and in the Western world, in many parts of North Africa and the rest of the world. So the Palestinians were scattered. So from 1956, you have the scattering of the Palestinian people, what the Palestinians called as a Nakba, the Nakba, the catastrophe, as they call it. Almost like the Shoah of the Holocaust that the Jewish people experienced under the Nazis in Europe. So the Nakba is a very significant experience as far as Palestinian people are concerned. From 48 onwards, you have seen the scattering of Palestinians, and in 1967, very significant thing, in this 1967 Arab-Israeli war, Israel captured many Arab lands, as you know, the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt, the Golan Heights of Syria, and the West Bank and Gaza Strip, which were administered until then by West Bank by Jordan and Gaza Strip by Egypt, but all were occupied by the state of Israel. So the rest of the Palestinian territories, East Jerusalem, West Jerusalem was already taken over by the Jewish side when the state of Israel was formed in 1948, but East Jerusalem, which was part of the rest of the Palestinian territories, which was controlled by Jordanians until then, all these territories, East Jerusalem, West Bank, and Gaza, all were occupied by the state of Israel in 1967. So that ultimately meant that the whole of historical Palestine, that part which became the state of Israel, and now West Bank and Gaza and Jerusalem, particularly East Jerusalem, all territories of historical Palestine is under Israeli control. And it still is the reality from 67 onwards. Even though militarily Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip, but Gaza Strip is always under the Israeli bombardment, etc., as you all know. So it's still under occupation. The occupation did not end. So this is the crux of the problem, that the Palestinians, not only that their independent state was not being established in 48, but that they continue to be under the colonial occupation of the state of Israel from 48 onwards, from 67 onwards completely. So now you have the Palestinian reality of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, Palestinians of Jerusalem, Palestinians in the state of Israel. 1/5 of the Israeli population, around 21% of Israeli population is Palestinian. So they are Israeli citizens, but identify themselves as Palestinians. And in the recent developments, you might see what you have seen in May this year, big bloodshed, major attack on Gaza Strip, and the conflict in the West Bank, all started with East Jerusalem, the eviction in Sheikh Jarrah, and so on. You have seen the Palestinians within the state of Israel demonstrating in support of their Palestinian folk within the occupied territories of West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. So you have a kind of solidarity also developing, which is expressed in much more obvious terms during this year's conflict. So that Palestinian identity is a very important thing, even though they are scattered, but all of them within historical Palestine under Israeli control. The state of Israel on the one hand, and the occupied by the state of Israel, occupied Palestinian territories. These are territories occupied in a war, and therefore continuation of that occupation is illegal under international law. The UN Security Council Resolution 242, which was adopted immediately after the 67 war, asked Israel to withdraw from the occupied territories immediately. But nothing happened, as you know, until now. And after the 1973 Arab-Israeli war, there was Resolution 338 to call all the parties for peaceful settlement through negotiations for resolving the Palestine question, but nothing much was happening, even though many negotiations happened later, particularly in the 1990s. So the problem, you now would understand that the major problem is this question of the freedom for the Palestinians to establish their own political entity, their own sovereignty, independent state, etc. Religion, etc., become an important part of that, not only the religious persuasion of the people, Muslims and Christians, but also because of the status of Jerusalem, which is a major religious city for all three major religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And therefore, and Palestinians considering East Jerusalem as their capital. And an objection to that is not only a political question, but also a religious question. But it is related to the establishment of a sovereign nation state for the Palestinians. So what you see from 1964 onwards is systematic colonization of the West Bank and Gaza. More and more Jewish settlements are established in the West Bank, and in Gaza also they established that, but they were withdrawn later. But in the West Bank, it's expanding every day as we speak. Thereby, whatever Palestinian land is left for a future Palestinian state is now being slowly taken away from the hands of the Palestinians. That is why Sheikh Jarrah, etc., become very important. Huge, massive construction in the occupied territories by Israeli settlers. This is a major problem, and skirmishes occur every now and then between the settlers and the local inhabitants, local Palestinian inhabitants, and so on and so forth. That's one form of colonialism, colonizing the land and establishing the Israeli settlements. The other kind of colonialism is control of the everyday movement of the Palestinians. There are several checkpoints in the West Bank where if a Palestinian person has to go from one village to another, one town to the other, They have to pass through Israeli checkpoints because the Israeli military authorities, it's under their occupation, and therefore the occupation forces are controlling the everyday life of Palestinian people. So controlling everyday life is part and parcel of the Israeli colonization of Palestine, particularly after 1967. And the Palestinians have to take permission to cultivate their land, what to do in their land. And then you have seen the building of huge wall between the state of Israel and the West Bank, what is called the apartheid wall. And you have different roads for the Jewish settlers to go into various settlements in the West Bank, and you have Palestinian roads where Palestinians can travel, where checkpoints are established at every point. Clear-cut apartheid policies that you could see. This is true within the state of Israel as far as Palestinians are concerned. I told you 1/5 are Palestinians, 1/5 of Israeli citizens. The Israeli Basic Law was changed in 2018 by Netanyahu government, which the title of the new Basic Law is the Basic Law, the nation state of the Jewish people. Earlier, the state of Israel was toying with the idea of Jewish state or democratic state or Jewish and democratic state, all kinds of debates within the state of Israel. But ultimately they've settled to under the right-wing government of Netanyahu that it is a Jewish state. So that's what 2018 Basic Law stipulates. That simply means that the Palestinian population, Palestinian citizens of Israel are second-class citizens by law. And typical apartheid policy that you see. So there are limitations of what a Muslim Palestinian or Christian Palestinian citizens of the state of Israel can do. It is no more their state according to their religious identity, etc. So by definition, by legal constitutional definition, they've become second-class citizens. So the apartheid policies are continuing not only in the West Bank and Gaza and in East Jerusalem, but also within the state of Israel. So throughout historical Palestine, what you see is this kind of double standards. And that is why 2-3 reports, which are very significant, that have came about in this year itself, 2021. In March, you had the International Criminal Court declaring that it is inquiring into war crimes, potential war crimes that Israel has conducted in the Gaza Strip in 2014, when there was major attack on Gaza Strip and killing of several Gazan people, several Palestinians in Gaza. So the International Criminal Court is declaring that we suspect that Israel has done war crimes, crime against humanity. It's the International Criminal Court stating that. After preliminary inquiries for a few years, that they found that there is enough scope for inquiry against it, the conduct of the state of Israel for war crimes. And also, you've seen in, I think January 2021, B'Tselem, which is a human rights group, a Jewish human rights group in Israel, coming out with its report, stating that the title of the report, I think I have it here. It says that a regime of Jewish supremacy from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. This is apartheid. This is the title of the Jewish Human Rights Organization's report. That from the Jordan River, that's the end of the West Bank, from the West Bank to the Mediterranean Sea. That is the whole part of historical Palestine is under Jewish supremacy, and this is apartheid. So everywhere you see apartheid policies. So Jewish organizations themselves exposing Israeli state's apartheid policy. Then you had the Human Rights Watch, again bringing out a report this year, talking about, its report said the title is A Threshold Crossed, Israeli Authorities and Crimes of Apartheid and Persecution. This is the title. So it says that the authorities have dispossessed, confined, forcefully separated, and subjugated Palestinians by virtue of their identity. And so you could see that at the international level itself, even though under the aegis of UN, etc., many of these things were told earlier, and many countries expressed their opinion like that, but it's increasingly being accepted at the international level that there is an apartheid regime in place which segregates people on the basis of their identity and which denies people in the West Bank, in Gaza, and in East Jerusalem their rights, basic rights, and their lands are being confiscated, and every day, arrests and torture of Palestinian prisoners are being undertaken. You might have heard the story of Palestinian prisoners escaping from Israeli jails, etc. And that's a continuing saga of the Palestinians. So the denial of a sovereign nation state to the Palestinians, to everyday occupation and apartheid policies continuing till this moment. That is the major aspect of the Palestine question. What were the Palestinians doing to resist this? One was from the 1960s, the Palestine Liberation Organization came into being, and it became the spearhead of the Palestinian struggle, particularly in the 70s and 80s. There were several groups coming together to form the PLO. PLO was an umbrella organization. It became famous under the leadership of Yasser Arafat. And the PLO initially was a fighting organization. It thought it's only through military means that Palestine could be liberated. And many organizations, the PFLP, the DFLP, many other Palestinian liberation organizations also were wedded to an armed fight against Israeli occupation and colonization. Later, in the mid-70s, in 1974, there's the famous speech of Yasser Arafat in the UN General Assembly, where he stated that I've come with a freedom fighter's gun and an olive branch. So don't allow the olive branch to fall from my hands. That was his appeal to the international community. And the PLO slowly came to the negotiating table and recognized the state of Israel. And that was in 1988 itself. And then in the early 90s, participated in negotiations with Israel in the Oslo process. And in 1993, the Oslo Accord, you have the establishment of a Palestinian Authority, whereby Yasser Arafat could come back from North Africa, where he was in the diaspora, Palestinian population coming back as the head of this Palestinian Authority. It is no big authority at all. It's like a municipal government. You are working under Israeli occupation, under the Israeli occupation forces. So it's not a sovereign government or anything. It is just an administrative system where certain aspects of security, certain aspects of municipal rule of different cities, etc., are undertaken by them. Certain aspects of life. It's a kind of subcontracting occupation by Israel. The whole fanfare about Oslo Accord was that, there are these both sides as equal, bargaining entities arriving at a peace deal. But the reality is that if you do not end the occupation, where is the independent Palestinian Authority coming into being? You have a Palestinian Authority, which is basically devoid of any sovereign, self-determining character, because it functions under Israeli occupation. In 1987, which is very important in the lives of the Palestinians, particularly Palestinians in the occupied territories, you had the first Intifada, big Palestinian movement, a large chunk of women's participation in that movement. It was more or less a non-violent Palestinian resistance to Israeli occupation. And that caught up global imagination about the Palestinian cause. Because earlier, Palestinian fighters were using hijacking of planes, the military means, etc. But this was fairly non-violent kind of resistance against Israeli occupation in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank. And it was in that context that in 1988, the PLO recognizes the state of Israel, and then the declaration of Palestinian independence was undertaken, and it was going to negotiations later. But the beginning of it has something to do with challenges PLO was facing from the occupied territories, because the PLO until then was basically an organization of the Palestinian diaspora. That schism between Palestinians in the occupied territories and Palestinians in the diaspora was there, because it was very difficult even to meet each other, communicate with each other, because the whole occupied territories was under the Israeli control. But the Palestinians within the occupied territories themselves taking up the mantle of resistance through the first Intifada. And what forced the Madrid Peace Conference in the early 90s and the signing of the Oslo Accord by 1993 is the result of the Intifada. But whether the Palestinian rights were fully established in the Oslo process, that's a major question. Many Palestinian intellectuals, like Edward Said, the famous Palestinian intellectual, opposed the Oslo process, saying that it is submitting to the interests of the state of Israel. Palestinians are not getting anything substantial out of this. Many Palestinian leaders opposed it, many supported it, and so on and so forth. Now, increasingly, the Palestinians see the Palestinian Authority as a stumbling block in achieving their goal of establishing an independent Palestinian state. because much of the security work, etc., that the Palestinian Authority do is under the insistence of the occupying Israeli authorities. And that creates lots of problems. Several incidents happened like that. And then the postponement of the Palestinian elections by Mahmoud Abbas is another cause of disgruntled. The increasing division between the Palestinian Authority led by Mahmoud Abbas, and large chunk of Palestinian population, particularly the younger generation Palestinians. And what you have seen in the recent developments in May 2021 is the younger generation of Palestinians coming out in the streets against the forceful eviction of Palestinians in East Jerusalem, in the Sheikh Jarrah area. And then the whole bombardment by the Israelis in Gaza Strip and the fighting that ensued, both within the West Bank and within Israel proper, where between Palestinian citizens of Israel and the Israeli forces. There were many tussles that were happening within Israel, that was happening in the West Bank, and heavy bombardment of Gaza Strip was happening. Around 260 Palestinians were killed in those events. It was during this time that you could see the whole Palestinian population, whether they are in the diaspora or in the 48 borders, that is in Israel, or in the occupied territories, or wherever they were coming together in solidarity and asserting a Palestinian position. And there is substantial transformation within the Jewish people also. Many Jewish intellectuals for a long period of time supported the Palestinian cause. Maxim Rodinson, for example, wrote his famous book, Israel, a Colonial Settler State, as a Jewish intellectual whose parents were killed in Auschwitz under the Nazis. You could see that such people were coming in open support to the Palestinian cause from the 1960s itself. And Abraham Leon, who was killed in Auschwitz, again was critically looking at the whole process of establishing the state of Israel. And then you have not to mention about Noam Chomsky or Norman Finkelstein and other Jewish intellectuals. There's a whole range of Israeli historians, Jewish historians, like Ilan Pape, Avi Shleim, and others, who have written a whole lot about the massive expulsion of the Palestinian people during 1948. That revisiting of 1948, the moment of the establishment of the State of Israel, this was unearthed through archival sources, through radio broadcasts of that time. And these historians have done tremendous work in showing the world that, how Palestinians were decimated in several villages when the State of Israel was established, and also how the continuing apartheid policy is harming Palestinian interests. So during the May events this year, you have also seen solidarity demonstrations across the world, particularly in London and various cities in the United States. In the US, traditionally, the Jewish population had, they vote for the Democrats, but there has always been the organizations like the IPAC, which provided the kind of base as a lobby group for supporting Israeli policies and enlisting American administration support for the state of Israel. But the kind of force that they had in as a lobby in the United States now is being challenged by other Jewish groups also, like J Street in the United States, and so on. And if that generation of a large chunk of American Jews supported the state of Israel, the younger generation is more conscious about the atrocities committed by the Israeli state against the Palestinians, and therefore you might have seen innumerable Jewish students and younger people coming to the streets in support of the Palestinian cause. So there is a very evident shift in the position of a younger generation of Jewish people, especially in the United States, in support of the Palestinian cause. So the Palestinian cause basically is fought by majority Muslim Palestinians, Christian Palestinians, and there are support from various Jewish groups, even though within the state of Israel, the overwhelming support for extreme Zionist policy still exists, and that is a major problem as far as Palestinian, the resolution of the Palestinian question is concerned. So continuing occupation, apartheid policies, the expansionist policies of the state of Israel, these are major problems, stumbling blocks, and the kind of occupation that is on, the everyday colonialism that is on. These are issues that we have to consider in thinking about the contemporary situation of the Palestinians and thinking about their future. I'll stop there and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. It is always a roller coaster of emotions, knowledge, facts, and critical thinking listening to you. And the way you have given the lecture, it's obviously a very vast subject, but you have tried to cover a very critical point in understanding the main issues of Palestine. Thank you so much, sir. I think this was the end of the day. I would like the way you have explained how the political aspects of the Palestinian questions from the historical point of view, and how the British mandate has established the in Palestine, and how and tracking it to currently to 2021. It is always intriguing listening to you on all the different aspects, the problem of colonization and the two different type of colonizations you also discussed, the systematic colonization and the control colonizations, which gave us a very clear understanding of what kind of colonization Palestinian is still living in. And very interestingly, it's always interesting to listen to you, and today also I find something new, like the reports which you told us, the 3 different reports which came out. It is like something new to our to this lecture. Thank you so much, sir, for your time.
Okay. Thank you.